My name is Tessa. I am 24 years old. And for as long as I can remember, I have never once sat at the dinner table in my own home. Not because there wasn't room. There was plenty of room. The Caldwell dining table seated 8 people comfortably, with carved mahogany legs and a centerpiece that Sylvia replaced every single week with fresh hydrangeas from the florist on Market Street. 8 chairs. 3 people in the family. And me standing in the kitchen doorway waiting to clear the plates before the food even had time to go cold. That was my place. The doorway. Always close enough to be useful. Never close enough to belong. I grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina in a neighborhood called Landfall, the kind of gated community where the lawns look like golf courses and every driveway has at least one luxury SUV. The Caldwells lived in a 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch, plantation shutters, and a backyard pool that I skimmed leaves from every Saturday morning before anyone else woke up. From the outside it was the kind of home that made strangers slow their cars down just to look. From the inside it was something else entirely. Franklin Caldwell was a corporate attorney, the kind who wore cufflinks to breakfast and never raised his voice because he never had to. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel like a problem he hadn't yet decided how to solve. He drove a charcoal gray Mercedes and kept a glass of bourbon on his desk every evening from 6 o'clock onward, not because he was an alcoholic, but because he believed it was the mark of a civilized man. He was not a civilized man. Sylvia Caldwell was worse in the particular way that beautiful, cold women can be worse. She hosted charity luncheons and chaired the board of the local arts council. She volunteered at the Children's Hospital twice a year and made sure the local newspaper knew about it both times. She wore linen in the summer and cashmere in the winter, and she smelled like Chanel No. 5 and fresh cruelty. To everyone outside that house she was gracious, warm, the kind of woman other women wanted to be. To me, she was the woman who handed me a list of chores every morning before I had eaten a single thing. And then there was Colton. Franklin and Sylvia's son. He was 26 now, 2 years older than me, broad-shouldered and easy-smiling in the way that boys are when the world has never once pushed back against them. Colton had gone to UNC Chapel Hill on a full academic scholarship, pledged a fraternity, graduated with honors and came back to Wilmington to work at his father's firm. He had never done a single load of laundry in his life. He had never scrubbed a toilet or swept a floor or stood over a hot stove at 6 in the morning. He had never had to. That was what I was for. I want you to stay with me through this story because what happened the night of Colton's engagement party changed everything I thought I knew about who I was and where I came from. If you've ever felt invisible inside the place you were supposed to call home, I think you'll understand why I kept silent for so long. And if this is the kind of story that speaks to you, please subscribe because what I'm about to tell you took me 24 years to be able to say out loud. Now let me take you back. Let me take you all the way back to the beginning so you understand exactly how it was. I do not have a clear memory of arriving at the Caldwell house. My earliest memory is of the kitchen, the black and white checkered tile floor, the weight of a mop handle in my hands and Sylvia's voice from the other room telling me I had missed a spot. I was 5 years old. I know that because I remember the birthday that came and went without a cake, without a song, without anyone acknowledging it at all. Sylvia gave me a new mop head instead. She said it was practical. She said I should be grateful. I slept in the utility room off the back hallway. It had a narrow cot, a single bulb on a pull string and a small window that faced the side fence. In the winter the pipes in the wall made noise all night. In the summer the room trapped heat like a closed fist. There was no dresser, only a row of hooks on the wall where I hung the 3 outfits that constituted my entire wardrobe, all of them practical, all of them colorless, all of them chosen by Sylvia. My days had a structure that never varied. I woke at 5:30. I started the coffee. I set the table, the real table, the mahogany one with the hydrangeas, and I made breakfast from scratch because Franklin believed that a hot breakfast was non-negotiable. By the time the Caldwells came downstairs in their robes, the eggs were plated, the toast was buttered, and I had retreated to the kitchen to eat whatever was left over from the preparation. Scraps. Whatever hadn't made it to the good plates. After breakfast, I cleared and washed by hand because Sylvia said the dishwasher left water spots on her china. Then I vacuumed the downstairs, dusted the surfaces, wiped down the bathrooms and started the first load of laundry. By noon I was on my knees scrubbing the baseboards or reorganizing the pantry or polishing the silver that Sylvia brought out for guests and put away immediately after, as though it existed only to be cleaned, never to be used. In the afternoon I started dinner prep. In the evening I served. After they finished, I washed up again, wiped down the counters again, and went to my room. That was every day. Every single day for as long as I can remember. I never went to school. Franklin told anyone who asked that I was homeschooled, that Sylvia handled my education personally. The truth was that Sylvia handed me a stack of outdated textbooks when I was 7 and told me to figure it out. I taught myself to read properly from novels Sylvia discarded after her book club finished with them. I taught myself arithmetic from the grocery receipts I was sent to manage. I have never taken a standardized test. I have never sat in a classroom. I have never had a teacher look at me and tell me I was capable of something. What I had instead was Sylvia's voice, precise and practiced, telling me what I was incapable of. You're not quick enough for that. You wouldn't understand. That's not something girls like you need to worry about. Girls like you. I used to lie in my cot at night and try to figure out what that meant, what category of person I belonged to that was so different from Colton, from the Caldwells, from everyone else in that house. I never arrived at an answer that made sense. I only arrived at the one Sylvia had already given me. Some people are meant to manage a household. That is an honorable thing, Tessa. You should take pride in it. I took pride in nothing. I took careful note of everything. I noticed, for instance, that I looked nothing like the Caldwells. Franklin had pale blue eyes and light brown hair going silver at the temples. Sylvia was fair-skinned and blonde, the kind of blonde that came partially from a salon in the historic district and partially from genetics. Colton looked like both of them blended together, tall and light and polished. I had dark hair that curled at the ends when it was humid, which in Wilmington meant most of the year. My eyes were a deep amber brown, almost gold in certain light. My skin was olive-toned in a way that didn't match a single person in that house. I asked Sylvia about it once. I was 9 years old and I had just seen a photograph of Franklin's family reunion, 40-something people with the same pale coloring arranged on a beach somewhere. Where are my people? I had asked her. Where does my family look like me? Sylvia had set down her coffee cup and looked at me with that flat, patient expression she used when she thought I was being particularly stupid. You don't have people, Tessa. You have us. And you should be very grateful that you do. I was quiet after that for a long time. Years, actually. I stopped asking questions that led to that kind of answer. I stopped looking at photographs. I stopped wondering about the girl in the mirror with the amber eyes and the dark curling hair and the face that belonged to no one in that house. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself this was my life and there was nothing beyond it worth imagining. Then Colton got engaged. And the man who would become his father-in-law walked into the Caldwell house for the first time, looked across the living room and stopped moving completely. His face went white. His glass tilted in his hand. And he looked at me, not past me the way everyone always did, but directly at me, with an expression I had never seen directed at my face before in my entire life. Recognition. I didn't know it yet. But everything was about to come apart. I had spent 24 years being looked through like glass. I had carried trays and scrubbed floors and folded other people's laundry and told myself that invisibility was simply the condition of my existence. But Daniel Voss, the father of the woman Colton intended to marry, did not look through me. He looked at me like a man who had been searching a very long time and had just, without warning, found exactly what he was looking for. And in that single moment, standing in the Caldwell living room in my plain gray dress with a serving tray in my hands, my entire life cracked straight down the middle. I need to back up slightly because before I tell you what happened the night Daniel Voss saw my face, you need to understand what the weeks leading up to that evening actually looked like inside the Caldwell house. Because the engagement party didn't arrive quietly. It arrived like a storm system that had been building offshore for months. And every single day of preparation made my position in that household more humiliating than the last. Colton had met Adrienne Voss at a charity gala in Raleigh 14 months before the engagement. She was the kind of woman who entered a room and reorganized it simply by existing in it. Tall, composed, with dark eyes and a calm that read as confidence rather than coldness. She worked as an environmental attorney for a nonprofit and drove a sensible car and wore the kind of simple jewelry that costs more than it looks like it does. I liked her, actually, in the careful, distant way I allowed myself to like anyone. She was the only person who had ever walked into that house, looked directly at me and said hello like she meant it. Her father was Daniel Voss. He had built a regional construction company from nothing over 30 years, the kind of business that now had his name on office buildings across 3 states. He was not old money the way Franklin pretended to be. He was something Franklin secretly envied far more than old money. He was self-made. Thought. The kind of man whose handshake meant something. I would learn all of this later. The night of the engagement party, I only knew him as the man who had looked at my face and gone completely still. But I am getting ahead of myself again. Let me tell you about the 6 weeks before that night because those 6 weeks matter. The moment Colton announced the engagement at dinner, Sylvia began planning a party with the focused intensity of a military operation. She wanted it at the house. She wanted it catered. She wanted floral arrangements from the same florist on Market Street who supplied the weekly hydrangeas, but doubled in volume, cascading from every surface of the downstairs. She wanted a bartender, a string quartet for the first hour, and passed appetizers on silver trays. She wanted everything to look effortless, which meant she wanted me to work harder than I ever had. The guest list was 60 people. Colleagues of Franklin's from the firm, neighbors from Landfall, Sylvia's Arts Council friends, Colton's fraternity brothers who had settled in the Carolinas, and the Voss family, Adrienne's parents, her older brother Marcus, and a handful of relatives driving in from Asheville and Charlotte. Sylvia treated the Voss family's attendance the way a theater director treats opening night. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to signal that the Caldwells were exactly the kind of family worth marrying into. She handed me a typed list on a Monday morning 3 weeks before the party. 4 pages front and back. Deep clean the entire house top to bottom. Polish every piece of silver. Launder and press all the table linens. Refinish the scuff on the hardwood near the front entry. Source and iron the cocktail napkins in the specific shade of ivory Sylvia had circled in a catalog. Coordinate with the caterer. Coordinate with the florist. Confirm the bartender's arrival time. Make sure the guest bathroom had fresh hand towels changed every 45 minutes during the event itself. I read through the list twice. Then I folded it and put it in my pocket and started from the top. Because that was what I did. That was the only thing I knew how to do. What I did not know, and what I was not told until 4 days before the party, was what my role during the event itself would be. I had assumed, the way I always assumed things that turned out to be wrong, that I might be allowed to simply be present. Not as a guest, I had stopped imagining that kind of thing years ago. But perhaps in some acknowledged capacity as someone connected to the family in whatever vague and undefined way the Caldwells had always implied I was. A household member. A ward. Something with a name that wasn't just the girl. Sylvia disabused me of that notion on a Tuesday evening. She found me in the kitchen ironing the ivory cocktail napkins and told me, without looking up from her phone, that I would be serving past appetizers alongside the caterer's staff for the duration of the party. She had arranged a uniform. Black trousers, white button-down, black apron. She had purchased it in my size without asking my measurements, which meant she already knew them, which meant she had been planning this for longer than she let on. "Is there a problem?" she asked, still looking at her phone. "No, Mrs. Caldwell." "Good." "And Tessa," she finally looked up, her expression the particular blend of pleasantness and warning she had perfected over decades. "The Voss family doesn't need to know the specifics of our household arrangements. If anyone asks how you're connected to us, you tell them you've worked for the family for years." So, just that. Do you understand? I understood. I had always understood. The Caldwells were not embarrassed by what they did to me inside the house. They were embarrassed by the thought of anyone finding out. The night of the party arrived on a Friday in late October. Wilmington in October is the most beautiful it ever gets, the heat finally breaking, the air carrying the first real suggestion of autumn, the old oaks on the streets of Landfall holding their color just before they let go. I had been awake since 4:30. By the time the caterers arrived at 3 in the afternoon, the house was immaculate. Every surface gleamed. The silver caught the light from the chandelier in the dining room and threw small bright shapes across the ceiling. The floral arrangements were in place, ivory and blush roses spilling from tall vases in the entryway, the living room, the dining room sideboard. It looked like a magazine. It looked like a home where people were happy. I changed into the uniform Sylvia had left folded on my cot and pulled my hair back and took my position near the kitchen. The caterer's staff arrived, 4 of them, young and efficient, and they looked at me with the easy solidarity of people who understood exactly what kind of evening this was going to be. We exchanged nods. We did not exchange names. There wasn't time. Guests began arriving at 7. I moved through the living room with a tray of crab-stuffed mushrooms and watched the Caldwells perform the version of themselves they saved for company. Franklin was warm and expansive, laughing loudly at his own jokes, refilling glasses with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely loved people rather than the man who sat silently behind his bourbon every evening ignoring the person who had cooked his dinner. Sylvia was luminous, touching every woman's arm when she spoke to her, remembering details about people's children and vacations and renovations in that precise way that made people feel uniquely seen. Colton moved through the room like he owned it, which in every way that mattered he did. Adrian stayed close to Colton's side for the first hour, gracious and warm, accepting congratulations with a smile that looked genuine because it was. Once when I passed her with the tray, she reached out and touched my wrist lightly and said quietly, "That smells incredible, did you make those?" I said yes without thinking. She said, "Of course you did, they're perfect," and moved on. It was such a small thing. I carried it with me for the rest of the evening like something fragile. The Voss family arrived at 7:20. Adrienne's brother Marcus came first with his wife, then two aunts from Charlotte who immediately gravitated toward the bar, then Adrienne's mother Eleanor, a small, bright-eyed woman who looked like an older version of her daughter, and then Daniel Voss. He was shorter than I expected from the way people spoke about him. Compact and solid, with close-cropped silver hair and the hands of someone who had done physical work for a long time before he could afford not to. He wore a dark blazer over a collared shirt, no tie, and he moved through the front entry with the unhurried ease of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone in the room. Franklin swept toward him immediately, hand extended, his voice pitched at its most impressive register. "Daniel, so glad you could make it. The firm is honored." Daniel shook his hand without matching the volume and smiled politely and said something I couldn't hear over the string quartet. Then he stepped further into the living room. His eyes moved across the space the way a person's eyes do when they're getting their bearings, registering the room, the guests, the arrangements. And then his gaze landed on me. I was standing near the far end of the living room with my tray, waiting for a cluster of guests to clear so I could move through. I wasn't doing anything remarkable. I was simply standing there in my black and white uniform, the way I had stood in doorways and hallways and kitchens my entire life, waiting to be needed and otherwise invisible. But Daniel Voss stopped walking. Not slowed. Stopped. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Something shifted in the way a person shifts when a memory surfaces without warning. He stared at me with an intensity that made the back of my neck go warm, and for one strange suspended moment, the noise of the party seemed to pull back like a tide. Then Eleanor touched his arm and said something and he blinked and looked away and the moment collapsed. I turned and moved toward the kitchen. My hands were steady on the tray. My heart was not steady at all. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself I had imagined it. I was good at that. I had been telling myself things meant nothing for 24 years. But 20 minutes later, when I came back through the living room with a fresh tray, Daniel Voss was standing exactly where I had left him. And he was still watching the doorway I had walked through. Waiting. He found me in the kitchen. Not the caterer's staging area near the back door. Not the hallway where I ducked between passes to straighten my apron and catch my breath. The actual kitchen, the one where I had spent the better part of 2 decades standing over a stove and scrubbing someone else's dishes. He pushed the door open quietly, the way people do when they're not entirely sure they're allowed to be somewhere, and stood in the frame for a moment before he spotted me refilling the tray with the last of the stuffed mushrooms. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was lower than I expected. Measured. I set down the serving spoon and turned. "Mr. Voss." I must have looked alarmed because he raised one hand slightly, a small gesture that meant I'm not here to cause trouble. "I just need a moment." I glanced toward the door. Through the narrow gap I could see the edge of the living room, Sylvia moving through the crowd with her practiced smile, Franklin holding court near the fireplace. Neither of them looking this way. "Not yet." "Your name is Tessa," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly like I had confirmed something he had already worked out. "How long have you lived with the Caldwells?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was strange but because of how he asked it. Not how long have you worked for them. How long have you lived with them? Like he already understood that what happened in this house was something other than employment. "Since I was very small," I said carefully. "I don't remember a time before this house." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved across my face in that same deliberate searching way they had in the living room, cataloging details the way a person does when they're trying to reconcile what they're seeing with something they've been carrying in their memory for a long time. It was not an unkind look. It was the most focused attention anyone had ever paid to my face in my entire life, and I did not know what to do with it. "Do you know anything about where you came from?" he asked. "Before the Caldwells." I felt the familiar shutdown begin, the one that happened whenever questions moved in this direction. The careful blankness I had learned to put on like a coat. "There was a fire," I said. "Records were lost." "That's what I was told." Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of something he had already suspected and had hoped was not true. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and produced his wallet, and from the wallet he withdrew a photograph. It was small and creased at one corner, the kind of photo that had been handled many times over many years. He held it out to me. I took it. The image was a woman, somewhere in her late 20s, with dark curling hair and amber eyes and an olive complexion that I recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting. She was laughing at something outside the frame. She looked alive in the way that people do when they don't know their photograph is being taken. "Who is this?" I asked, though something deep and wordless in my chest already knew that the answer was going to cost me something. "Her name was Renata," Daniel said. "She was my younger sister. She passed away 11 years ago. Ovarian cancer. She was 31. "I'm sorry," I said automatically. The photograph was warm from his pocket. I could not stop looking at it. "Before she got sick," he continued, "she had a daughter. The baby was taken from a hospital in Charlotte when she was 4 months old. Renata had gone home for the night because the nurses told her the baby was stable and she hadn't slept in 3 days. She came back in the morning and the bassinet was empty. He spent 6 years looking. After the diagnosis, when she understood she was running out of time, she hired a private investigator and told him to keep looking after she was gone. He made me promise to do the same." He met my eyes. "I have been looking for 17 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the string quartet had finished their set and someone had put on low background music instead, something instrumental that drifted through the door like it belonged to a different world. I stood holding the photograph of a woman with my eyes and my hair and my face and I could not speak. "I need you to understand something," Daniel said. "I'm not trying to frighten you or disrupt your life. I came here tonight for my daughter's engagement and I had no expectation of anything beyond that. But when I walked into that living room and saw you standing there, I stopped breathing for a moment. Because I have been carrying a photograph of Renata for 17 years and I know her face the way I know my own. And your face is her face." He said it simply, without drama. Just a man stating a fact he had verified in his own mind many times in the past hour. I could be wrong. I don't believe I am. But the only way to know for certain is a DNA test. My hands had started to tremble. I set the photograph on the counter because I was afraid I would drop it. "What you're describing," I said slowly, "means that the Caldwells." "I know what it means," he said quietly. "They would have had to know where I came from. That I wasn't theirs." He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The silence answered it instead with a weight that pressed against my sternum like a hand. "Here is what I want you to understand about the moment that followed. I had spent 24 years being told that I was fortunate. That the Caldwells had taken me in when no one else wanted me, given me a roof and food and a purpose, and that the correct response to all of this was gratitude expressed through labor and silence and the complete absence of needs or questions or desires of my own. I had believed it not because it made sense but because I had no alternative framework. When you have never been told a different story about yourself, you accept the one you have been given." But standing in that kitchen while Daniel Voss waited with the patience of someone who had learned how to wait over 17 years, I felt the story I had been given begin to loosen at its edges. Like wallpaper in a humid room. Like something that had only ever been adhered by the absence of any competing truth. "I will do the test," I said. He nodded. He reached into his pocket and produced a business card and a small folded piece of paper with a phone number written in ballpoint pen. "The card is my office. The number is my personal cell. Call me when you're ready." He picked up the photograph from the counter and looked at it for a moment before returning it to his wallet. Then he said, "Whatever the results show, you deserve to know the truth about where you came from." And he walked back out through the kitchen door and into the party. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that one of the caterer's staff poked his head in and asked if I was all right. "Fine," I said. "Just needed a minute." He gave me the look people give when they don't believe you and retreated. I folded Daniel's number and tucked it into the waistband of my apron, the only place I had with any certainty of privacy. Then I picked up my tray and walked back out into the living room and circulated through the party for another 2 hours, offering bruschetta and smoked salmon crostini to people who did not see me, while inside my chest something fundamental was rearranging itself into a shape I didn't yet recognize. Sylvia cornered me near the end of the night. The guests had thinned and the caterers were breaking down the bar, and she materialized at my elbow the way she always did when she wanted to make a point. "I saw Daniel Voss go into the kitchen," she said, her voice pleasant and very quiet. "What did he want?" "He thought we were out of mushrooms," I said. "He wanted to check." She looked at me for a moment. The pleasant expression did not change. The eyes behind it did. "Make sure the kitchen is clean before you go to bed," she said. "The caterers don't do floors." Then she crossed the room to Franklin and leaned in close to say something that made his expression tighten almost imperceptibly before he recovered and laughed at something a departing guest said. They knew something had happened. They didn't know what. And for the first time in my life I had something they didn't. A question with the shape of an answer already forming around it. A phone number folded against my ribs. I cleaned the kitchen floor at midnight. On my hands and knees the way I had done it 1,000 times before. But this time I was thinking about a woman named Renata with dark curling hair and amber eyes who had spent 6 years searching and died before she found what she was looking for. I was thinking about a baby taken from a hospital bassinet in Charlotte in the middle of the night while her mother slept, exhausted and trusting, 3 miles away. And I was thinking about the fact that somewhere behind the closed doors of the lives built on top of mine, Franklin and Sylvia Caldwell might know exactly how I had arrived here, and what they had done to make sure I never found out. By the time I turned out the kitchen light, I had already decided. I was going to call Daniel Voss in the morning. Because the alternative was going back to sleep in my narrow cot beneath the pull-string bulb and pretending I had not just seen my own face in a dead woman's photograph. And I was done pretending. Tonight had simply made it impossible to look away. I called him at 7:15 the next morning. Not because I was brave. Because I was standing in the kitchen making Franklin's coffee and watching the steam rise from the kettle and thinking about Renata Voss dying in a hospital bed at 31 years old, still waiting for someone to tell her where her daughter had gone. That thought was what made my hands stop shaking long enough to dial. Daniel picked up on the second ring. I expected surprise. There was none. Like he had been awake since before I had, sitting somewhere with his phone already in his hand, ready for exactly this call. "I'll arrange everything," he said. "There's a private lab in Raleigh I've used before. Certified, discreet, results within 72 hours. Can you get away tomorrow morning without raising questions?" I told him I could. Every Tuesday Sylvia had her hair done at a salon downtown, a 2-hour appointment she had kept without variation for 11 years. Franklin was in court most Tuesdays. Colton was at the firm. Tuesday mornings were the closest thing I had to time that was my own. And even then it was only because no one happened to need me, not because I was permitted to exist without purpose. "Good," Daniel said. "I'll text you the address. And Tessa." His voice shifted slightly, became more careful. "Until the results come back, I need to ask you not to change anything in your routine. Don't let them know something has happened." It wasn't difficult at all. I had been hiding the truth of my interior life from the Caldwells since I was old enough to understand that having one was dangerous. One more thing to conceal was not a burden. It was just Tuesday. The problem was that Sylvia already suspected something. I had seen it in the look she exchanged with Franklin the night before, in the way she watched me cross the kitchen that morning with the particular focused attention she usually reserved for things she was deciding how to handle. He was not a stupid woman. She had maintained a lie for 24 years, which required a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that is always scanning for cracks in the surface. And Daniel Voss spending 8 minutes alone with me in her kitchen was a crack she had noticed. She said nothing about it directly. That was how Sylvia operated. She never confronted anything head-on when she could surround it instead. What she did was tighten the perimeter. She found reasons to keep me close that day, invented tasks that kept me in the house invisible. She decided the dining room curtains needed to be taken down and hand-washed. She asked me to reorganize the pantry shelf by shelf. She invented a dinner party for the following weekend that required immediate planning, which gave her reason to sit at the kitchen island with her tablet and her reading glasses and work on a guest list while I moved around her, never quite out of her line of sight. I performed normalcy with everything I had. I moved slowly and deliberately. I kept my face empty the way I had learned to keep it empty. When she asked me at lunch whether Daniel had said anything else in the kitchen, I looked up from the counter with what I hoped was mild confusion and said he had asked where we'd gotten the flowers, that his wife liked hydrangeas. Sylvia held my gaze for 3 full seconds before looking back down at her tablet. The lie was not elegant, but it was specific, and specific details are harder to dismiss than vague ones. That night I lay awake on my cot thinking about the shape of what came after the DNA results. If the test confirmed what Daniel believed, then the Caldwells had knowingly taken a stolen child and built a household labor system around her for 24 years. That was not a family secret. That was a federal crime. And federal crimes, when they surface, do not surface quietly. I thought about Colton. Not with sympathy exactly, but with something adjacent to it. He had not been cruel the way Franklin could be cruel. He had simply never seen me as a person, which in its own way was its own kind of damage. But he was about to marry Adrienne Voss. And Adrienne's father was the man who had spent 17 years looking for his sister's stolen child and was now 72 hours away from finding out whether he had. Whatever came next was going to land in the middle of their beginning. There was nothing I could do about that. I had made my peace with it before the pipes in the wall started their nighttime noise and I finally fell asleep. Tuesday morning I told Sylvia I needed to go to the pharmacy. She was already dressed for her salon appointment, coat on, bag over her arm. Be back by noon, she said without turning around. I walked out the front door and kept walking to the corner where I called a rideshare, because I did not have a car and had never been given reason to learn to drive one. The lab in Raleigh was in a quiet medical building off a tree-lined street, nothing that announced itself as significant from the outside. Daniel was already in the waiting area when I arrived. He stood when I came through the door and handed me a cup of coffee fixed exactly right, which either meant he had guessed or he had thought carefully about it beforehand. Either way, it was the first time someone had prepared something for me without being asked. The test itself took less than 10 minutes. A technician swabbed the inside of my cheek twice, labeled the sample and gave me a form to sign with a case number at the top that Daniel's private investigator had originated years ago. 72 hours for standard processing, she said. Results to the contact on file. She looked at Daniel when she said it. He nodded. We sat in the parking lot afterward in Daniel's truck because neither of us was ready to simply leave. He told me about Renata. Not the facts of her disappearance. He told me who she was. She had been a graphic designer, self-employed, working from a converted spare room in her apartment in Charlotte. She had been particular about coffee and terrible at returning phone calls, and she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. She had wanted 3 children. She had been 31 weeks into her first pregnancy when the complications began, and the baby had been delivered early, small but stable, placed in the neonatal unit while Renata recovered 2 floors above. She never decorated the nursery, Daniel said. She wanted to wait until the baby came home. He stopped. Looked out the windshield at nothing. She never got to bring her home. I looked at my hands in my lap and thought about a woman I had never known who had nevertheless given me my curling hair and my amber eyes. I thought about the nursery that had never been decorated. The room that stayed empty while I grew up sleeping on a cot in a utility room in Wilmington, serving a family that had purchased me like an appliance and housed me like one too. I want to ask you something, Daniel said. Before all of this, did you ever try to leave? Once, I said. When I was 16. I had saved bus fare from the grocery change over 4 months and made it as far as the Greyhound station downtown. A man at the ticket counter asked for my ID and I didn't have any and I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there until Sylvia arrived. She didn't say a word to me the entire drive home. She just took the money and handed me a new chore list when we got inside. Daniel's jaw tightened. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That was the last time?" I thought about it honestly. There had been other moments. A phone number I had found in a magazine for a trafficking hotline that I had memorized and been too afraid to dial. A letter I had written at 19 that described everything, every rule, every year of it, that I had torn into small pieces and flushed because I couldn't think what else to do with it. Not leaving exactly. More like reaching toward a door I couldn't find the handle for. As I told Daniel. That was the last time. He nodded. He started the truck. "Let me take you back," he said. "You shouldn't be late. And Tessa." He looked at me directly before pulling out. "Whatever those results say, you already know the truth. You've known it for a long time. You just didn't have anyone to believe you yet." I rode back to Wilmington with his words sitting in my chest like something warm and entirely unfamiliar. I was home by 11:40. Sylvia's car was still gone. I changed my shoes and started the prep for that evening's dinner and told myself 72 hours. Just 72 hours. The 72 hours passed like pressure rather than time. I moved through the house doing what I always did, and the whole time I felt the Caldwells watching me with a sharpness that told me their instincts were working even if their information wasn't. Franklin paused in the kitchen doorway both Wednesday and Thursday in a way he never normally did, as if measuring something. Sylvia asked me twice whether I was feeling all right, a question she had never once asked in 24 years. It was not kindness. It was reconnaissance, and we both knew it. On Thursday evening, Colton called to say he was bringing Adrian to dinner Friday night. Sylvia agreed immediately and handed me a menu. Rack of lamb, roasted fingerlings, wine from the cellar. I wrote it down. My handwriting was steady. My mind was elsewhere. Because Friday morning, before any of it, my phone buzzed under the counter with a message from a number I had saved under a single initial. Results are ready. Call when you can. And I understood that by the time dinner was served that evening, I would know exactly who I was. I called Daniel from the back hallway at 6:50 in the morning, before Sylvia came downstairs, before Franklin's alarm went off, before the house had any sound in it beyond the refrigerator hum and the distant bird noise coming through the window above the utility sink. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and the phone pressed to my ear, and I listened to him read me the results. Probability of biological relationship: 99.94%. The tested individual shares mitochondrial DNA consistent with full matrilineal descent from the late Renata Celeste Voss. Conclusion: the tested individual is the biological daughter of Renata Celeste Voss, deceased. I did not cry. What the moment produced instead was silence. A very deep, very complete silence, the kind that happens when a noise you have lived with so long you stopped hearing it finally stops. 24 years of being told I was nothing. 24 years of a family that had looked at my face every single day and known, and said nothing and handed me a mop instead. Tessa, Daniel said carefully. Are you still there? I'm here, I said. His voice was steady, but I could hear what was underneath it, grief and relief and something that had not yet found its name. I've already been in contact with the FBI field office in Charlotte, he said. They reopened the case file 2 days ago when I submitted the preliminary results. There are agents who want to speak with you when you're ready. But nothing happens without your consent. You control the timing. You control all of it from here. I had never controlled a single thing in that house. Not the hour I woke, not what I ate, not whether I was allowed to speak without consequence. And now Daniel Voss was telling me that what happened next was mine to decide. I need 1 day, I told him. He said, take whatever you need. I said no. 1 day specifically. There's something I need to do first. I spent that day in the ordinary performance of my life for the last time. I made Franklin's breakfast. I cleared his plate. I vacuumed the downstairs and started the laundry and prepped the lamb for that evening's dinner. I moved through every task with a precision that surprised even me because I understood I was memorizing it. Not because I would miss it. Because I wanted to remember exactly what it had looked like so I would never be tempted to minimize it or tell myself it had not been as bad as it was. Adrian arrived at 6:30. She came through the front door with a bottle of wine and her easy smile, and she found me in the kitchen finishing the sauce, and she said, that smells like something my grandmother used to make. And I said, I hope that's a good thing, and she laughed and said it was the best possible thing. Then she looked at me with those calm dark eyes and said, are you all right? You seem like you're carrying something heavy. I told her I was fine. I was not fine. But I was ready, which felt close enough. Dinner was served at 7. I stood in the doorway the way I had stood in that doorway 1,000 times and listened to the Caldwells perform their family for the last time. Franklin making toasts. Sylvia laughing. Adrian asking questions about the neighborhood in the warm, curious way of someone trying to know a family they are about to marry into. I watched Sylvia answer those questions and I thought about all the questions I had never been allowed to ask. I thought about being 9 years old and asking where my people were. I thought about the bus station and the chore list handed to me on the drive home. I thought about Renata Voss being told the bassinet was empty. I thought about all of it with the clarity that comes when you finally know the truth and the truth turns out to be exactly as bad as you suspected. After dinner I cleared the plates, washed the good pan, wiped the counters, and then instead of going to my room I walked into the dining room where Franklin was still sitting with the last of his wine, and I said, I need to speak to all of you. The room went still. Sylvia looked at me with that measuring expression she had been wearing since the night of the engagement party. Franklin set down his glass. Colton looked confused. Adrian looked at me carefully, like someone already half prepared for whatever was coming. Kept my voice even. I got a DNA test 3 days ago, I said. The results came back this morning. I am the biological daughter of Renata Celeste Voss, who was taken from a hospital in Charlotte when she was 4 months old. I watched their faces do what faces do when a truth held down for a very long time finally breaks the surface. Franklin's jaw tightened. Sylvia's color drained so completely she looked like a different person, smaller, older, stripped of the performance she had been running since before I could remember. Agents from the FBI field office will be here tomorrow morning, I said. I thought you should know tonight. No one spoke. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Then Sylvia said my name. Just that. Tessa. In a voice I had not heard from her before, something stripped of the practiced warmth and the practiced coldness both. Something underneath all of it that might have been the closest she had ever come to honesty. I looked at her and I did not say anything because there was nothing left for me to say to her that the morning would not say more completely. I went to my room and lay on my cot in the dark and thought about Renata. She had named me before she lost me. Somewhere in the records Daniel's investigators had pulled, there was a document from a Charlotte hospital with a name chosen by a woman who had loved me before she had the chance to know me. I thought about the nursery that was never decorated and the private investigator she had hired from a hospital bed in her last months because she refused to stop looking even when her body had already started to give up. I did not sleep. I was not afraid. I lay there in the last hours of the only life I had ever known and let myself feel the full weight of what had been taken from me, not with bitterness, but with the honesty you owe yourself when the truth has finally arrived. The FBI agents arrived at 8:15 the following morning, 2 of them in plain clothes, quiet and unhurried. Daniel was with them. He stood in the entry of the Caldwell house for the first time and looked at me across the foyer, and something passed between us that I still do not have an adequate word for. The specific recognition of 2 people who have been looking for the same thing from opposite sides of a very long darkness and have finally found it. Franklin was arrested in the kitchen. Sylvia was arrested in the living room. I watched from the hallway and I did not feel what I expected to feel, which was triumph. What I felt was quieter than that and more permanent. The particular stillness of a thing that is finished. 24 years of a life built on a crime, dismantled in the space of a single morning while the October light came through the plantation shutters and fell across the mahogany table and the hydrangeas that were just beginning to go brown at the edges. Colton did not come downstairs until it was over. He appeared at the top of the staircase and looked down at the empty foyer and then at me. We looked at each other for a long moment. I saw a man who had lived his entire life inside a lie arranged for his comfort and had never once thought to question it. I did not hate him for that. Hatred requires energy I had decided to spend differently. I moved into Daniel's home in Raleigh 3 days later. There was a guest room with a window that faced east, and the first morning I woke there the light came through the curtains and landed across the bed and I lay still for a long time just looking at it. I had appointments ahead of me, a patient advocate, a college admissions consultation. I had a legal name, Tessa Renata Voss, confirmed by a court and printed in clean black ink, and I kept that document in the nightstand drawer and touched it every morning the way you touch something you are still not entirely convinced is real. Franklin received 16 years. Sylvia received 11. The sentencing judge read into the record a line I have not forgotten. No child is born to serve. Every child is born to be known. I sat in that courtroom and heard those words and I thought about Renata, who had understood that before anyone told her, who had spent 6 years and the last of her strength trying to find her way back to me. I am writing this from a desk in a room that belongs to me. The window faces east. There are books on the shelf that I chose myself and a lamp I picked out from a store on a Tuesday afternoon because I liked the color of it, which is a thing that should not feel remarkable and does anyway. In the morning the light comes in and I let it. And every morning I understand a little more completely that this, precisely this, is what I was always supposed to have. The first time I walked into a courtroom as something other than a victim, I was 27 years old and wearing a blazer I had bought myself from a shop on Fayetteville Street on a Saturday morning when I had nowhere to be and no one to report back to. Dark green, which is not a color I had ever been allowed to choose. I had stood in the dressing room for a while looking at my reflection before I bought it, still occasionally surprised by the face in the mirror. The amber eyes. The dark curling hair. The face that belonged to Renata, which meant it belonged to me. I was there to testify on behalf of Claire, another survivor, brought into a domestic labor situation at age 7 under circumstances that rhymed uncomfortably with my own. She was 19, sitting in the gallery with her jaw set in the particular way that people hold themselves together when they are doing something that costs them everything. I had sat in that exact posture once. I recognized it the way you recognize a language you grew up speaking. I told the court what I knew. The patterns, the specific mechanisms of control that traffickers use to make children compliant and adults invisible. I spoke for 40 minutes, and when I was done, the opposing counsel had no questions. The judge thanked me and I walked out into a marble corridor where Daniel was waiting with 2 cups of coffee. He handed me mine without asking how I took it, the same way he had the first morning in the Raleigh Lab parking lot 3 years ago. We stood in the corridor and drank our coffee, and he asked me how I felt, and I said like I did something that mattered. He said, "You did." Then we went back in for the verdict. Claire won. I want to tell you about the 3 years between that October morning in Wilmington and the courtroom in Raleigh, because the distance is not as simple as recovery. Recovery is the word people use when they want to believe trauma has a finish line. What actually happens is that you rebuild yourself out of materials you find along the way, and some of those materials are things you already had, buried so deep under the life imposed on you that you didn't know they were there. Here is what I found when I started looking. I found that I was good with people in the particular way that comes from having spent 24 years watching them perform emotions they didn't feel while concealing the ones they did. I could read a room the way a cartographer reads a map, noting the pressure points, the silences, the small involuntary gestures that told a different story than the one being spoken aloud. My therapist, Dr. Anand, told me this was a survival skill that had calcified into something I could choose to use deliberately. You spent 24 years learning to read the people who held power over you, she said. That's not damage. That's data. The question is what you do with it now that you're the one deciding. I enrolled at Wake Technical Community College 4 months after leaving Wilmington, general studies first, then social work and psychology. When my professor taught the unit on coercive control in her family violence and policy course, I sat in the 3rd row and took notes and did not mention my familiarity with the subject matter. Afterward she stopped me and said, "Your written work reads like someone who has lived inside this subject." I told her I had. She asked if I had ever considered advocacy work. I said I was considering it seriously. Daniel and Eleanor gave me space to become someone without rushing the process, which was its own form of generosity that I did not fully appreciate until later. They did not treat me like a project or a cause. They treated me like a person who had arrived at their home under difficult circumstances and was figuring out the next chapter, which is a thing that happens in families all the time and does not require commentary. Eleanor taught me to cook properly, not the functional institutional cooking I had done for the Caldwells, but the kind that is about pleasure and feeding people you love. She taught me that a meal is an act of care when chosen freely and an act of submission when it is not, and that the same hands can do both things and the difference is entirely in who decides. I learned to drive at 25. Daniel taught me in the parking lot of a church near their house on Sunday mornings when it was empty, and I stalled the car 14 times in the first session, and he did not once make me feel foolish for it. By the 5th session I had applied for my license. The examiner who administered my test told me I had good instincts and handed me my license with a smile that had nothing behind it except ordinary professional pleasantness, and I sat in the car afterward and held it and cried in the way I had not cried the morning I heard the DNA results. Sometimes the small things are the ones that break you open. A driver's license with your real name on it, given to you by a stranger who has no idea what it represents, can be the thing that makes 24 years of captivity real in a way that a courtroom verdict cannot. I saw Colton once in the 2 years after the arrests. He was working at a hardware store near the university, which I know only because I drove past it on a Tuesday afternoon and saw him through the window. He was helping a customer with something from a high shelf, focused and unhurried, with the expression of someone doing a job because they needed to do it and not because anyone had arranged it for them. I pulled over and sat there trying to decide if what I felt was satisfaction or sadness or something that didn't have a name because it contained too many things at once. I decided it was the latter. I drove on. Adrian called me 8 months after everything ended. Not Colton. Adrian. She had heard through Daniel that I was at Wake Tech and she asked if she could take me to lunch. No agenda, just lunch. We ate at a Thai place near campus and she told me she had ended things with Colton 3 months after the arrests. Not because of what his parents had done but because of what his silence had enabled, the decades of not asking, not noticing, not choosing to see. She said, "I think he's a decent person who made an indecent choice for 26 years. And I can understand that and still decide it's not something I can build a life alongside." I told her I thought that was an honest and fair assessment. We have had lunch 6 times since then. She is not a close friend in the way that people who have grown up together are close friends. She is something more specific. A person who existed at the exact intersection where my old life ended and my new one began, and who chose without obligation to keep showing up on the new side. I think that counts for something. I think it counts for quite a lot. I graduated from Wake Technical with honors in the spring of my 27th year. Daniel and Eleanor sat in the 3rd row, and Eleanor cried from the moment the processional began, which she had warned me she would do and which she did with the complete lack of self-consciousness of a woman who understood that some moments are worth crying through regardless of who is watching. Daniel took photographs from the moment the processional began and did not put his phone away until I had my diploma in my hand. Later, when he showed me the images, I looked at the woman in them for a long time, the amber eyes and the dark curling hair and the dark green blazer, and I thought about Renata. I think about her every day. Not with grief exactly, though grief is part of it. I think about her the way you think about a place you came from and never got to return to. She was 25 when I was taken, which means she would be 49 now. Sometimes I try to imagine what that version of her would look like, whether she still would have laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, whether she still would have been particular about coffee. I think she would have been the kind of person who got better at being herself over time, and I hope she has found some form of the peace she spent 6 years trying to earn. There is a framed photograph on my desk. It is the one Daniel gave me in the parking lot of the Raleigh lab the morning the results came back. Renata laughing at something outside the frame, her dark curling hair loose around her shoulders, her amber eyes bright with whatever moment someone had thought to capture without her knowing. I look at it every morning before I open my laptop. I think of it as a beginning rather than an ending, which I know is not entirely rational but which feels more true than the alternative. My name is Tessa Renata Voss. I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, to a woman who wanted me completely and lost me before she had the chance to show me what that meant. I spent 24 years being told I was born to serve. I know now that I was born to something else entirely. I'm still finding out what that is. I find I do not mind the finding. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.